What's up, everyone? Today I would like to talk about the functional elements of punk fashion. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, by punk fashion, I mean the classic stereotypical look of mohawks, leather jackets, spikes, studs, boots, the whole deal, right? And when we look back, we sort of see this as a whole package, right? It's already like developed. This is obviously punk. You see somebody looks like that, this is a punk band. They probably play punk music, even though there is like a wide variety of punk music and punk bands and punk styles. But for most people, when you think of like what is the punk fashion, what is punk style, it's the mohawks, it's the spikes, it's all that stuff, right? And this sort of started, it started getting more popular in the 80s. So they had like the UK 82 thing. This more extreme look started coming in. Like personally, I feel like it's hard to deny the influence of things like, I don't know, post-apocalyptic films and things like, there's like Death Wish and stuff like that, right? Where all the bad guys are some sort of street punks, you know what I mean? They don't really listen to punk music, and they just sort of dress weird because the costume department just put them in things, but it sort of became like this, like, oh, those are the delinquents. That's how delinquents dress. It's sort of wild and crazy and a little bit scary sometimes, right? So it's hard to deny the influence of movies in building that up. But then in the 80s, it really started taking off in the punk scene, and a lot of people like dressing like that. It was a lot more extreme. It was really like where punk got its like visual impact from, right? Like all of a sudden everybody cared because everybody looked crazy and scary, right? And a good example from the 80s is, of course, GBH. Uh, it's a classic look, the big mohawks and all that stuff. And this look really carried on into the 90s. It had its own sort of like resurgence in a way, like its own second or third or whatever wave. And like bands like Rancid, they became a little bit more mainstream, got a little bit more like attention from the mainstream, and that brought this like typically street punk look into like people's homes. Everybody saw it now. They could identify that with punk music, right? And then it continued on like into the late 90s. A good example from the 90s is, of course, the Casualties. And these days we would easily call these guys street punk, and they are street punk. And, if you really wanted to like categorize everything, then the look I'm talking about is street punk, but that's like far more knowledge about punk music than like most people have, and so they just have this like one image of like what punk fashion is, right? Like, I mean, I'm not even wearing like the typical like street punk thing, but I think it looks pretty punk rock still, right? But in terms of the typical like the typical fashion, the classic fashion, like there are two things here. I think there is like the aesthetic element, right? So there's things that people do because it looks cool, and then there's the like practical functional element, and it's things that people did because like they kind of had to, right? And I mean, like we can start. Let's start at the top. Let's start with the mohawk. And this is easily like you could say this is definitely an aesthetic element, right? And like where did it come from? Like I think a good spot once again is movies. If you look at Taxi Driver starring Robert De Niro, that's sort of the first like mainstream depiction of a mohawk, right? And like Taxi Driver is like definitely a classic like punk rock kind of film. It's one of my favorite films, obviously. And he was sort of the first one to like popularize the mohawk, and it's more of like it's really small. It's not the extreme kind of thing, but it was a very like early depiction of like a classic punk look with the like military jacket and the mohawk, right? And so, like, of course, adopting that later is sort of an aesthetic idea, right? Like, you like the way it looked in the movie, so you're going to try it yourself. But the thing is, it's also, you can make the argument that a mohawk is also very practical. Because if you don't have a lot of money and you can't spend money on haircuts all the time, the mohawk is one of the easiest haircuts to do yourself. And I know this for a fact because not only did I used to have a mohawk, but during the pandemic, when I couldn't get a haircut anywhere and it was getting out of hand, I gave up and I gave myself a mohawk because I remembered how to do it from back in the day, right? And it's also very easy to have somebody else fix it up for you. So I could have my wife during the pandemic fix it up if I couldn't get to the back or something, which was always, the hardest part. So there is actually like a functional, practical purpose to having a mohawk in a way, because it's like, you don't have a lot of money, you can't go to salons, you can't get nice haircuts all the time, you gotta cut your hair every couple of weeks, right? Well, the mohawk lets you do it yourself. So this is sort of what I'm talking about here, right? It's like there's like the functional and the practical elements, and there's the aesthetic elements, and sometimes they could be the same thing. And a lot of times, you found a very aesthetically friendly way to like solve functional problems, let's say, right? So, we can start with another really obvious one would be boots, right? Boots are like a classic piece of the whole punk fashion look, right? You gotta have boots, you gotta have like Doc Martens or something like that, right? And this, of course, is like this harkens back to like what is the working class roots of punk and oi and stuff like that, right? And I mean, you could say, of course, like boots are very practical, and in a working class sense, it's like you worked in a construction, you worked in a factory or something. You might have boots, you might have like Doc Martens specifically, right? And you might have steel toes, right? And steel toes were also, of course, like kind of a weapon in a way. Like, they're definitely like a little bit more effective in that sense, let's just say. But the thing is, there's also like, so like wearing them to like reference the working class roots of punk rock would be like considered an aesthetic use of the boots, right? But like realistically, like back in the day, I mean, any city these days, any city, anytime is like really dirty, right? And you're like walking around a lot. You don't want to be like wearing nice shoes, obviously. And you don't want to be wearing anything that's like sneakers and step in a puddle and who knows what's in that stuff, right? And you just got to throw those things out, I think. So, you know, having boots was a good idea when you're like, you might even be hanging out in the park, hanging out by the river. You never really know where you're going to end up. So having some boots was always a good idea, right? And then like the steel toes actually help because like you're going to shows, you're going to concerts. These are really really crowded, right? And I've been to like shows at CBGBs where it's like you're just not moving. It's it's packed as packed can be, and you're just not moving. And of course, people are gonna be trampling on your shoes, especially when like the band actually starts up and everybody sort of like lurches forward, you know. So it's good to protect your toes with some steel toe boots, right? And the thing is that like there's also like it's also like a historical thing because like up until about Vietnam, most militaries made leather boots, right? So they made leather combat boots. And then in around Vietnam or a little bit after that, they started making the canvas, like what we call jungle boots, and a lot of militaries use just that sort of thing these days. But back in the day, it was actually really easy to get your hand on some used leather combat boots. They were really cheap. You got them at like Army Navy stores. That's what we used to call like military surplus stores, right? And it really was just like a bunch of old junk from like all sorts of different militaries, right? And there'd be like piles of leather combat boots and like, and sometimes in questionable condition, but they were also pretty cheap, And the cheapest pair I ever got, I had to like chip some mud off of it, but they were only a couple of bucks. You know what I mean? So it was pretty easy to like just go to like any Army Navy store and find like a variety of leather boots that you could wear, and and them being broken in kind of looked cool too anyway, right? But they were also really cheap, and like you buy a pair and they don't last more than like a year or so, then you can just go buy another pair. It really wasn't that hard. These days, these days it's a lot harder. I'm finding to actually like find cheap leather boots. It looks like I'm gonna be spending about $200 or something for another pair of boots, and I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. You know what I mean? Because these days it is sort of an aesthetic choice, and I don't know how I feel about spending $200 just on the boots so that I can like look more punk rock, right? Um, but it is, it is sort of something that's like now it's a lot more aesthetic because like I said, it's harder to find just cheap old combat boots, right? So then like going from boots, let's go to pants, right? These days everybody loves crust punk pants, right? So they love crust punk pants. It's like, usually like kind of tight leather, or no, I mean tight denim pants, lots of stitching and lots of distressing and some patches and things like that. So everybody loves these because they look really cool, right? And now, in my experience back in the day, like crusties were like pretty crusty, right? They were like, you didn't just call them crust punks. It wasn't like somebody came up with this like cool subgenre name. It was sort of like they were like very crusty, right? And a lot of times, I mean, that's because like a lot of these kids were homeless or something like that. You know what I mean? Or they like just couldn't go back home. I mean, I know how that is, right? And so you end up being a little dirty, right? But they also maybe only had like one change of clothes. They only had like one pair of pants, maybe, right? And so you get a rip in them, you gotta sew it up. You get a big hole in them, maybe put a patch on there, right? And these pants got like, let's say, more and more distressed over time. So the more they wore the pants, the more the pants would fall apart. And the more you'd have to fix them up. And the crustier they would look, and the grosser they would be, and stuff like that. And these days, I guess crust punk pants are sort of like an aesthetic choice, right? Like it's something that people are like making specifically. Like they buy a pair of pants or something, and then they like make it look like crust punk pants. And I'm sure there's some people out there who are still like living the true crusty lifestyle, right? You know what I mean? But at the same time, like it was a very practical thing. It wasn't really like, I mean, like, yeah, it looked cool, and like, your other homeless friends probably looked the same. You know what I mean? And everybody's clothes got all like gross, and it's not like we spent a whole lot of money on them to begin with. But like it wasn't like people planned this. It wasn't like they were like, oh, the jackets look cool, let's make the pants look cool too. You know what I mean? It was more like, oh, this homeless kid's got to sew up his pants again. You know what I mean? And that's just sort of how it went. And like this leads into also like butt flaps, butt patches. So a lot of people have like a big square patch hanging down from like either their belt or the back of their jacket, right? So it would be like hanging down here, and like it looks cool. It's a great place to put like another patch, and it's another like way to like make use of an old T-shirt that's already fallen apart. Get a little bit too distressed and you can't really wear it, but the graphic is cool, so you can make a butt flap out of it. But also that was like a very practical thing too, because sometimes, I don't know if you've ever been camping. Sometimes people make a little, like they call it like a sit-upon or something, right? Well, this was like something that could just sort of protect what might be your only pair of pants while you're like sitting on a stoop or sitting in the street or sitting in the park, or like, I don't know, God forbid, sitting in a drunk tank or something, right? So when you sit on something, it would sort of protect your pants, right? So it was like a very practical thing. It was a good idea to like have something, a little extra something that you could like maybe even possibly, but probably not, wash on its own instead of washing your whole pants. You could just wash this little thing, and that's it. Which you probably weren't really washing a whole lot anyway. You know what I mean? Okay, let's talk about like back patches. So with the butt flap, I said it's a good way to reuse a T-shirt that like might have fallen apart, right? Well, the back patch here is another classic example of what to do with the T-shirt. And you see right here, the overall patchwork nature of punk rock stuff often like it was just like, I have this T-shirt that's falling apart. I have this shirt that doesn't fit or whatever it is. I found it in the garbage maybe. Or what do I do with it? So it's like, here we got some vintage plaid here. They don't fit. They're a little beat up or something in one way. This T-shirt didn't fit, so I made it into a back patch, right? And so it's a very useful thing when you just have like old T-shirts and stuff like that. Like, what do you do with it? This shirt fit, but then I shrunk it in the dryer, so now it fits perfectly as a back patch, right? And so that's another like just sort of practical thing that led to like the whole look, right? Because it's having a back patch is a pretty normal thing. Every battle jacket has like a big back patch these days, and like the cheapest and easiest way to do it back in the day was to just use an old t-shirt, because of course there was no Amazon or anything like that. You're not ordering patches. You'd have to actually go to the store and look through it and find one, and then spend way more than you wanted to spend just for a back patch, right? So the next thing is like spikes and studs, right? It's not very practical. It's very aesthetic. It's like, you know, primarily in the realm of aesthetic choices. It's not really like a practical choice. It's not really filling a functional need or anything like that. But at the time, it sort of does, because like, you know, if you live in a city, then you know people sometimes like to mess with you. You know what I mean? And especially if you're a kid, if you're like 15, you're alone on the subway, somebody's gonna want to mess with you. So in a way, like this sort of thing really did like, I don't know, make people think twice, or just make you feel better. Like maybe nobody else cared, just made you feel better. But it also like, you know, serves some sort of a purpose. Like I'm gonna say like this is really stretching in terms of functionality. You know what I mean? Like it's not really a functional choice. It's definitely more of an aesthetic choice. But I can make like a small argument in favor of it being kind of like a practical choice, right? And so I think that like that covers a couple of things. I think I make my point about how like a lot of stuff that especially specifically is like street punk style, what we would call street punk style, really came from a lot of like, yeah, practical functional needs. You know what I mean? Boots and patches and crust punk pants and everything. You know, it really did have like it had its purpose. It has its use. It was there for a reason. You know what I mean? And like these days, like I guess there's a lot less of the like. Thankfully, there's a less homeless kids and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So everything is sort of like an aesthetic choice these days, and I think that's fine. That's good. And like if you want to look a certain way, that's great. And it's even more punk rock than anything. Just because you want to look a certain way, that's good. That's fine. I don't really care. Like, and like I think it's cool, and I think it's cool when people make their own things, and you know they customize things, and obviously like I customize things, and you know, so basically like the real heart of punk rock fashion is just like doing what you want, you know what I mean? And it could be that like, you know, back in the day you go to a show like the Virus at CBGB's and everybody would sort of kind of look similar, right? You know what I mean? So it wasn't like you were all rebelling against something. You all sort of looked kind of similar, right? And so, like, maybe if you were in that sort of a scene, then, like, not dressing that way was a way to rebel against the scene. And so, in a way, like, dressing kind of normal could be punk rock, right? You know what I mean? It all depends. All depends on, like, what you feel like doing, what you want to do, and how you feel comfortable dressing. You know what I mean? Like, you got to feel comfortable. You want to feel confident. You want to look good. But also, there's some functional needs that you need to fill sometimes. You know what I mean? And so it's just like with grunge, wearing a lot of flannel and a lot of thermals because it's freaking cold over there. And like flannels and thermals, you know, piled up like to over your head at thrift shops. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of like functional, practical things that lead to what we view these days as an aesthetic element of a style or a fashion, but really it comes from people really like living the lifestyle. You know what I mean? It's really like a lived fashion. It's a thing that like developed because people actually lived it. I guess that about covers it for now. Thanks for watching.